May the words of my lips and the thoughts of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our salvation.
Amen.
I came across something rather wonderful reading around the texts for this week. It is this. Here is a rule of thumb that I use for reading Jesus' parables. If I interpret it in such a way that there's nothing surprising or even shocking about it, it's time to go back and read it again. This shook me right out of the totally misplaced sense of familiarity and comfort, because parables like today's remind me of being in church as a small child, which was my first response to this text. If I interpret it in such a way that there is nothing surprising, maybe even shocking about it, it's time to go back and read it again. There are worse rules of thumb to live by. In today's gospel, Jesus is talking about words and our hearing of them. The seeds sown, of course, are the gospel that is proclaimed. We speak, no pun intended, about the word made flesh. The Greek word here, logos, means creating, mediating, inspiring. Logos is the word used by John when he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." In the creation myth, God speaks, and the world comes into being. It is striking that the parable of the sower starts with one particular word, a sentence in its own right, a non-negotiable demand: listen. How could I listen again to this so familiar parable and be surprised? I said that I remember this parable from having been taken to church as a small child, and I suppose that must influence how I respond. The path or stony ground or the thorns or the fertile earth is analogous to people, and this is the bit that is quite childlike. People fall into one of those categories. End of story. Thinking about it as an adult, it occurs to me that it is much less clear-cut. In the space of just a few hours, I feel I can be attentive, open and receptive, and also completely oblivious, entirely missing the point of something right in front of me. That is what it is to be human, after all. Happily, I can critique things a little more acutely now than I could when I was in Sunday school. So I can ask, why would the farmer let seed fall anywhere but into the right soil in the first place? Jesus' original hearers would immediately have understood something that might pass us by. Farmers in first century Palestine would barely have been eking out a living from the land. They would not have had any seeds to spare. It would have been unthinkable to be so cavalier about where you sowed the precious resources that you had. Even if you carefully sowed every seed you had in good soil and then reaped a twofold harvest, that would be an extremely good year. But the farmer in this parable is totally careless, and yet the harvest is more than abundant, a harvest of 30, 60 or 100 times. Pope Benedict XVI says that the parables were not written into the Gospels to convey some sort of abstract knowledge that does not concern us profoundly. In each one, the hearer must enter into the movement of the parable and journey along with it. The parables are ultimately an expression of God's hiddenness in the world and of the fact that knowledge of God always lays claim to the whole person. And if the farmer represents God, that would mean that people, mixed up, fragile, inconsistent as we are, capable of being like the path and like stony ground and like thorns and like good soil too, almost all at once, that would mean that God does indeed lay claim to the whole person. The ways in which we are stony and thorny are equally loved and lovable, as much as any other aspect of the self. And of course, what follows from that is another question. What if the farmer is the church? We had better be very sure to be equally inclusive. It is not for us to decide what kind of people are like good soil, as it were. Here is something else that I read this week that is pertinent. If what you get out of the Bible is that God hates all the same people you do, you're in trouble. I also love this phrase that Benedict uses, an expression of God's hiddenness in the world. At the moment, I'm reading The Mirror and the Light, the final part of Hilary Mantel's astonishing trilogy about the life of Thomas Cromwell. Mantel writes about pages of Tyndale's printed Gospels being smuggled into England. In Antwerp, they slide the printed sheets of the Gospels between the folds of bales of cloth, where they hide, white against white, warm, nestled. God whispers within each bundle. His word sails the sea, is unloaded in eastern ports, travels to London in a cart. This is another phrase that I love. God whispers from within the folds of cloth, like the seed in the earth, enveloped, nurtured, growing. May we be the place where the abundant, inclusive love of God is nurtured. Amen.